Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Mark Clifford, who is president of the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, also was a director on the board of Next Digital, which was the publisher of the now defunct Apple Daily. That matters, of course, Mark, because we're talking about Jimmy Lai, who was the founder of Apple Daily. When I lived in Hong Kong, first of all, welcome. We know each other, both journalists from Hong Kong. Jimmy was a larger than life figure 2 decades ago, but for people who aren't aware, give us some context of who he is and what he built in Hong Kong.
Sure. Well, great to see you, Diane, and thanks for your interest. Jimmy was one of these amazing Hong Kong, literally rags to riches story. He came as an illegal immigrant to the then British colony at the age of 12, if you can believe it. He had about $4 in his pocket, anyway, a couple dollars in his pocket, started living in a factory, working in a factory. He was a child laborer.
Mm-hmm.
And he worked his way up. Pretty soon he was owning a factory, and he became one of the biggest sweater and polo shirt manufacturers in the world. He was supplying to the Limited and lots of big name companies, made his first millions that way. Got a bit bored with that and thought that retail would be a way to make more money. Saw the guys at the Leslie Wexner and the guys at the Limited taking all the fat margins. And so he set up he's kind of the father of fast fashion. He set up a company called Giordano. A guy Forbes has written about a lot, Tadashi Yanai at Uniqlo, came down and studied at his knee. Jimmy was kind of his mentor. Obviously, Tadashi Yanai and Uniqlo went on to just huge success, and Jimmy moved in a different direction. And after the 1989 Tiananmen killings, he decided he'd go into media. He'd move from clothes and fashion to media, and he set up Apple Daily newspaper and a magazine. It was extremely successful, both in Hong Kong and in Taiwan. Perhaps too successful for its own good, as it's turned out.
Well, let's talk about Apple, because Apple Daily has always been, I know some people call it pro-democracy, provocative, and I'm talk a little bit about that context, because it was around for a long time. Then they had an English language version, which I always found intriguing. What was the place of Apple Daily in the Hong Kong media scene?
Yeah, well, Jimmy brought his formidable retail and sales and marketing and design skills to media, and he really shook up the old gray Hong Kong media, literally gray, and started printing in full color. Really put a lot of competitive pressure on other publishers, but he was unabashedly pro-democracy. And from the early 1990s, really right after Tiananmen, when he set up Next Magazine, set up Apple Daily in 1995, 2 years before China took over the former British colony. He was banging the drum about democracy. And as Britain exited, they did a deal with China whereby China promised that Hong Kong would continue to enjoy all the freedoms that it had as a British colony and more. So there would be freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, above all, rule of law. And China went further and said, well, actually, you never had democracy. You had freedom under the British, perhaps, the Chinese would grudgingly say, but you didn't have democracy. So we're going to do one better. You're going to be even freer. We're going to let you elect the mayor and the city council. No big deal, really, honestly. But in the context of communist China, seemed like a big deal.
This is the one
Jimmy's
country, two systems that came in place after 1997, when the British essentially exited Hong Kong, handed it back to the Chinese.
Yeah. Yes. And so Hong Kong was able to keep its own currency, its own tax system, really quite extraordinary experiment. Jimmy actually took the Chinese at their word. And this is what's ironic, that he's on trial right now, because he's actually deeply patriotic. I mean, he loves his country so much, and he has such high hopes for it. And he thought that the economic reforms that he benefited so much from in the 1980s and 1990s, and Hong Kong was a huge beneficiary of China opening up under Deng Xiaoping. Jimmy thought that this would lead to more freedom, not just free markets, but free people. And it was, I think, a reasonable assumption. Again, he took the Chinese at their word and pursued a very, very pro-democracy agenda. And here we are 26 years after the handover, I guess, and things haven't quite turned out the way that he would like. And he's been in jail for over 1,000 days for more than 3 years. He was put in jail at the end of 2020 and hasn't been out since.
So he is currently on trial. I know he has pled not guilty to, I believe, sedition charges. We can get more into that. But I think the genesis of this to 2020 was that national security law for Hong Kong, which was right. And, we had the pandemic, we had the protests in Hong Kong, to remind people. How many people in general have been arrested under this law, and how unique is it?
Well, yeah, it's a broad, sweeping, vague law that basically says anything that you pro-democracy people do that we, the government, doesn't like means that we can put you in jail. You meet with Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo, as Jimmy Lai did, all of a sudden those are grounds for collusion with foreign forces, which, by the way, carries a potential life sentence, if you can believe it, a life sentence just for going to Washington and meeting with U.S. officials and calling for sanctions, calling for tough action to protect pro-democracy forces in Hong Kong. The numbers of political prisoners are, they're always a little bit difficult to nail down with absolute precision. But Hong Kong Democracy Council is counting over 1,700 political prisoners at this point. Over
taken under this law, Mark?
Not
was this
all
law
under
that...
this law. Yeah. I think under this law, it's around 100. I'm not sure the exact number at this point. There's a big show trial going on right now, 47, really the cream of the democracy movement who had the temerity to want to hold a primary to run for office. I mean, if you can believe it, this is the thing that's crazy about this national security law. For the most part, they're targeting professionals, lawyers, former government officials in some cases, academics, people who wanted to work within the system, wanted to work within a democratic electoral system. And for the most part, we're really trying to cool some of the more hot-headed young protesters. And the irony is Jimmy was often at odds with younger protesters who wanted a more radical, sometimes a more violent approach. But the law basically criminalizes any form of dissent. It's been used. It was used to shut down Apple Daily. It was used to force other publications to shut. And essentially all of civil society, pretty much any NGO that's politically involved, has shut down in the last 3 years.
I just had a friend in Hong Kong who said she could not get access to any of the major news channels, through, I guess, Sky News, BBC, CNN. What is the environment like right now in Hong Kong, post this law? And also, of course, we've seen other issues with regard to freedoms.
Yeah, well, the environment is chilled. I left Hong Kong 3 years ago. I was at that time the only director. At various times, I was the only director of Next Digital who wasn't behind bars, and I didn't know how long that was going to last. But the environment is absolutely chill. There's an incident of either self-sent or actually just people being carted off to jail for things that were completely normal a few years ago. So there's essentially no sort of pro-democracy newspaper. All of the organizations that used to commemorate the Tiananmen Square killings of 1989 have been forced to disband. Trade unions have disbanded. Over 100,000 people have emigrated to Britain alone. I mean, it's a sad, sad situation. And of course, most people in Hong Kong apparently still support democracy, but they've either left or they've just shut their mouths.
Can I ask, since you are director of Next Digital, can you give us some insight into some of the conversations prior to this happening? Because, of course, I don't know how much of it's a brainchild of, Chinese President Xi Jinping, but we've seen this clampdown on democracy for several years now. Were there warning signs? Was there conversations around trying to protect Jimmy Lai and his colleagues from basically being put into solitary confinement 3 years ago?
Well, I think the conversation, and I've known Jimmy for 3 decades, and the conversation, I would never presume to tell him what to do, but his attitudes seem to be full steam ahead. So I know many people who counseled him to leave. He knew that he was courting danger. In fact, I was the moderator of a number of live stream chats, where we would have people from the last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Patton,
Mm-hmm.
to the spiritual leader of Hong Kong, Cardinal Zen, to Nathan Sharansky, from longtime refusnik Soviet political prisoner. And Jimmy, every week we'd talk. Sometimes I said a lot, and sometimes it was just Jimmy grilling people like Sharansky, like, okay, I'm pretty sure I'm going to prison. What do I do? How do I become the best political prisoner I can? So Jimmy knew what he was doing. I think he was concerned with protecting other people, with protecting his staff, and uh, did counsel, a bit of pulling back after the national security law came into effect. In fact, the newsroom was raided on August 10th, 2020, just 6 weeks after the law came into effect.
Mm-hmm.
Jimmy was walked through the newsroom, really gutsy journalists there. The police were trying to shut them up, trying to shut down the computers, and they were interviewing him and live streaming him. And they said, "Mr.
I
Lai,
remember
what do we
that.
do?" Yeah, and he said, "Well, they cooked us a meal. We got to eat it." And he still didn't back down even after that. We had 250, over 200 cops in the newsroom. He didn't back down. Front page story when they let him out a couple days later. The front page picture was him embracing the CEO, and he just kind of went from there. And finally, at the end of December, they put it. He was in and out of jail a few times, but at December 31st, 2020 is when they basically kind of locked him up and threw away the key. And they've subjected him to a number of cases, completely crazy cases since then. But the big one, I guess the big enchilada is this national security law trial, where essentially, when you look at the charges, they're laughable. As I said, they're pretty much, he met with Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo. I'm not sure if Nancy Pelosi was in that one or not. He said, we really need help from Trump. Go easy on Trump. Let's see if we can get support from the rest of the world as we fight for democracy, as we fight for what we were promised in international treaties and in numerous undertakings by the Chinese, that we'd have democracy. We're just asking for what he wanted. And so it's insane, but I think it tells you the state of mind of Xi Jinping and where China is right now, that they're this determined to lock up a 75-year-old man, a man of nonviolence, a deeply spiritual Roman Catholic, and throw away the key. So I think this tells you how afraid China is of its own people.
It's interesting. I mean, I didn't realize is so take us back to December, first of all, where he's just pled not guilty to these charges. Is the crux of these charges about these meetings with Trump? Because it also incorporates to what he was writing and what Apple Daily was
Yeah.
doing as well. Does it not?
Yeah, he never actually met Trump. I believe he would
I
have
mean, not
liked
Trump,
to.
excuse me.
Yeah.
Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo,
Yeah.
to your point,
Yeah, the
perhaps
crux
Nancy
of it
Pelosi,
is,
but
yeah,
Americans.
the crux of it is that he met these people, and he called for sanctions against human rights abusers in China and above all in Hong Kong. That's a pretty legitimate thing. Governments do sanction other government officials when they feel it's necessary. So it's kind of crazy when I've been surprised myself at how little there actually is there, um, and I guess we'll have to wait and see if there's some smoking gun. I think that they're trying to tie him to the violence as well. Again, from everything I know about the man for 30 years, he is so deeply committed to nonviolence, and not for tactical reasons, really for spiritual and religious reasons. And so I think it's ironic that they go after a businessman, an entrepreneur of this stature, who's so committed to democracy and rule of law and working things out through legislative electoral processes rather than through violence in the streets. But that's where we are in
Yeah,
China right now.
I'm not. I'd love to talk about his mental state. I mean, a lot of people might assume this is a trial that'll go on for several more weeks, that it's a fait accompli, that it's a show trial. But we're also catching Xi Jinping at a different period than 3 years ago. The economy is, of course, in a tough state. There seems to be this move from Beijing to try to create a culture of appeasement with the rest of the world, engagement, come invest in China, come back to China. Do you think there's any chance that there might be an incentive to let Jimmy Lai free as a message to the world that Hong Kong and China are open for business, or is that kind of a fool's errand to suspect that?
I think that he will be let free, and I think it will be in that context, but I think he needs to be convicted first and serve more time. So the government itself, the Hong Kong government itself, has boasted that there is a 100% conviction rate for national security law cases. So think about that. Not many governments are proud and boast about 100% conviction rate. I would imagine even North Korea occasionally lets somebody says that they're innocent just to claim that they've got rule of law. But this is so Hong Kongers were promised that they would continue to have the right to trial by jury, just as they had under the British colonial era. That was thrown out.
This is not that, yeah.
Yeah. Not only that, but it's not just any judges. There's a secret list, a handpicked list of judges who are allowed to hear national security law cases. So they've chosen 3 judges who they feel are politically reliable and who can be counted on to do the deed and find Jimmy Lai guilty. So I think it's inconceivable that he would simply be let off and freed at the end of this trial. And by the way, it's likely to be quite a few more weeks. I would not be surprised if we were talking a year from now and we still didn't know the sentence. So it's actually going to be several months of the trial itself. There's going to be a long time for summation. Then they have to consider the verdict, even though we know it's going to be guilty. Then they have to think about the sentence. So this is going to drag on and on and on. But I think the longer it goes on, the worse it makes China and Hong Kong look. Because, as you say, Diane, Hong Kong wants to pretend that it's open for business, that it's a global financial center, let the good times roll again. And yet, how many financial centers do you know that have hundreds of political prisoners? I can't think
No,
of
it feels
another
very different. It feels very different. And I guess that, as we're talking about this, it feels a little bit almost existential, like we're just here to bear witness to what is rolling out. What are you doing? What, if any, levers are there at this point with Jimmy Lai and with, the situation in general that could actually affect positive change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, we have offices in both Washington and London. We're very, very engaged with legislators. Jimmy Lai, I should mention, is a British citizen. He's never been a Chinese citizen. He came to Hong Kong as an illegal immigrant, and he's never traveled on Chinese papers, other than when he left China at the age of 12 to go to Macau and then to Hong Kong. So he's a full British citizen, and I think that we have to continue pressing the British government to work for his release. The foreign minister, David Cameron, recently met with Sebastian Lai, Jimmy's adult son, who's been working tirelessly for Jimmy's release. We've got incredible legislative support in the UK in both House of Commons and House of Lords, not only for Jimmy, but I mean for the many, many Hong Kongers who are unjustly imprisoned, and much the same in the US. We've been pursuing a number of legislative angles, including, for example, shutting the Hong Kong Economic and Trade offices. Hong Kong essentially, or China essentially, has 3 extra consulates in the form of economic and trade offices, which push essentially a Communist Party line now. They don't give out visas or anything. They aren't consulates, but they were set up just before the handover to underscore the one country, 2 systems that we talked about before. The fact that Hong Kong was different. It was a city of business and trade, and wouldn't it be great to have separate Hong Kong economic and trade offices? But they've now become wolf warriors who go after media and push a false narrative. So we are working on a number of legislative initiatives. We also have backed sanctions, and that's risky. One of my colleagues, Francis Hoy, who has a young Hong Konger who has asylum in the U.S., just recently was one of those who got a bounty on her head. There's a reward of almost 130,000 US dollars if you turn Francis in and she's successfully prosecuted. Please don't. But that's the kind of links that the Hong Kong government is going to. There are bounties on 13 different Hong Kong activists living in some of the freest countries in the world: Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And the Hong Kong government has the temerity to tell people living in these countries that they can't, for example, work for sanctions, as Francis and I and others do. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. This trial is not just about Jimmy Lai. It's really about freedom everywhere, because today it's Francis, tomorrow it's you for talking to me. And I think China's willingness to apply the national security law in an extraterritorial fashion is absolutely extraordinary, and is something that we need to
and
push
frightening
back on.
and very frightening. I mean, one of the things to sort of close the loop on the conversation and bring it back to the U.S., I've seen David Cameron. You mentioned there's been a very vocal response from Britain, probably for a multiplicity of reasons, including, continued engagement with Hong Kong to some extent. In the U.S., we've just seen, President Biden met with Xi Jinping during the APEC summit. There seems to be this desire to try to build bridges again. Are you sensing any hesitancy on the part of U.S. politicians to be taking a strong stance on this case or on the state of freedom in Hong Kong in general?
It's a great question, and I would distinguish U.S. politicians from the executive branch. So in both London and Washington, we've had fantastic response from legislators, less so from the governments, from the executive branches. And the Biden administration is trying to manage a very difficult, very complex relationship. And yes, of course, they're moving they're soft pedaling the situation with Jimmy Lai and with Hong Kong, more than I think that they should. Let's see how things work out, but I would hope that if relations do improve, that we'd start seeing political prisoners released in Hong Kong. I mean, I don't want to be doing this job. I mean, I'm doing this because I saw my colleagues, and it's not just Jimmy. Yeah. I've got 7 colleagues who are in jail. The other 6 have all said they'll plead guilty. They're being held hostage so that they'll testify against Jimmy. They're not even let out on bail. They've been in jail for 2.5 years since the newspaper was shut in the summer of 2021. But we've got to start getting these people out, and I think that's going to take a carrot and a stick approach on the part of the Biden administration, on the part of the UK administration, on the part of actually freedom-loving countries around the world. I mean, they need to let China know that there's a price that China's paying for rolling back freedom. And of course, there are many, many political prisoners in mainland China itself. And I think we just need to keep working, not to tell China how it's going to run its country, but to allow its people to be as free as they want to be able to express their opinions. And in the case of Hong Kong, to start electing their own officials and start moving back to the one country, two systems freedoms that Hong Kong was promised.
A few other quick questions. Is the national security law at odds with the law in the rest of China? I mean, is it tougher for Hong Kong than it would be if you were committing, similar offenses in Guangzhou or Shanghai?
Good question. I'm not a legal expert, so I can't give you a definitive answer. I think if you do something that the Chinese government doesn't like, you're in trouble if they decide that you're in trouble. I mean, the only Nobel Peace Prize winner from modern times from China, Liu Xiaobo, again, a man of peace, nonviolent, is an essayist, and he died in prison.
Yeah. And heading into an election year here in the U.S., I know you're not a soothsayer necessarily on Donald Trump, but yet the genesis of this did happen under the Trump administration. Are you getting any sense as to what the feelings are about if Trump was reelected, if there would be another sort of continued approach to the policy that he had during his administration, or any shift from Republican Democrats in terms of the reaction to this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, again, a great question. I think one that China is very concerned about. I think it's perhaps less Trump himself than people like Matt Pottinger and Mary Kissel, who worked for Pompeo and the Secretary of State himself, who helped engineer a change, a course change. And I think Jimmy, who was very skeptical about Biden, would be pleasantly surprised to see how the current administration has essentially continued, and I would argue deepened the more skeptical approach towards China. I do think if you had another Trump administration, then it would potentially be even tougher. I mean, obviously, there's a level of consistency and certainty with the current administration that we didn't always see with the previous one. So it's a bit of a wild card, but I do think that we need to see the executive branch, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, embrace a much more robust, a much more aggressive, a much tougher approach toward China. I mean, China is preparing for war with Taiwan, and they clearly want to kick the U.S. out of the Western Pacific. I mean, it doesn't really matter who's in office. The people who are running the military and running policy need to prepare for that certainty, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think more conversations to be had, and I appreciate the context here, Mark. Good luck with your work, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for your interest, Diane, and look forward to talking again.